Hallelujah, Christ is risen. He's risen indeed. Hallelujah. Welcome to Mondays at Mount Olive for May 19th, 2025. Happy Monday. I'm Pastor Dan Torkelson, Senior Pastor at Mount Olive Lutheran Church in Madison, Wisconsin. And man, where has May gone? At this rate, summer looks like it's going to probably fly by, and I don't like that idea because it is one of my favorite seasons of the year. I've discovered in my old age that I like warm weather better than cold. Maybe I'm going to be a snowbird someday. We'll see. But I kind of feel like things need to slow down a bit. And there are some plans for that to happen here in the not so distant future for me to take a little bit of a break. It's been kind of a hard run since the school year started. And while I did take breaks at the sort of normal times, there are days when I surely do feel it. I'm feeling pretty good though today, feeling really good right now, and planning to take some time off here soon. Anyway, we had a wonderful Sunday again yesterday. Had a chance to celebrate our children one last time as they wrap up the Sunday school year for the year. The summer offers many changes in the schedule that I do sort of look forward to. I've come to appreciate around the years, especially hopefully more visitation and probably a little bit more continued study as well. And I'm going to be trying, like I said before, to get a little rest in as well. It's been like I said, it's been quite a push, but with the podcast adding to an already busy schedule, and it is something I really enjoy doing. There's nothing about what I do in the ministry that I don't enjoy doing. But anyway, it's been it's starting to feel like I need to do that, and it's going to happen here soon. I'll just promise you that. And thank you, those of you who've expressed concerns about it. Some of you do it regularly. Some of you do it when you're concerned about it. I always appreciate that. Let's do a little rewrap of an interesting little statement in the gospel lesson from yesterday. It was sort of what I tried to make the children's message / sermon into. I tried to really work on that particular statement of Jesus because that one seems to be one of the more controversial statements of Jesus from the upper room. This whole, the last few weeks of Easter, it seems to me that the gospel lessons tend to really emphasize John's accounting of the upper room, which is his longest discourse. It's John middle of 13 through John 17, the high priestly prayer, and there's a lot of things Jesus talks about in there. The one that seems to rile the disciples the most was actually the text that we heard yesterday. It was the middle of John 16. And there was one particular statement in John 16:16, verse 16, easy enough to remember. Jesus says, "A little while and you will see me no longer, and again in a little while and you will see me." And the disciples immediately react to that statement. There's a sort of a, what in the world is he talking about here? And when I was talking about it with the kids yesterday, I have to say one of the children pointed out that this was going to quite literally be true very, very quickly. I don't think she realized when she said it that, again, this is in the upper room. This is Maundy Thursday when Jesus says this, and the application is going to be very, very quick. But there's a way in which that was one of the layers of meaning. It seems like a lot of things Jesus says in the upper room discourse. I'm going to mention another one here just off the top of my head, one that people know really well from John 14 about in my Father's house are many rooms. If I go there to prepare a place for you, I will return to take you back to be with me where I am, has got probably about 3 levels of meaning. That going there to prepare a place and coming back, it's probably got about 3 levels of meaning, probably very similar to the ones I'm going to talk about here. Because I think when Jesus says in a little while, he's talking about something quite similar. A little while and you will see me no longer, and again in a little while you will see me. The first layer of meaning, correctly identified by the children, is just simply that Jesus is going to die and be buried, and he's going to rise again. And that's all happening, Jesus is saying these words in the upper room. That's all happening in the next several hours. It's going to happen in less than a day that they will see him no longer. But again, in a little while, and truthfully, the word little while there works, the expression a little while works there, because day and a half. We talk about the 3 days because of the way Jews count days and counted days in those days. But it was only about a day and a half in the tomb, a minimum of time. In truth, a little while. They saw him again. They saw him again Sunday evening. back in the upper room where he said these words in the first place. And so that's interesting that he made sure that he appeared to them the first time in the very same place he said these words. So in that first fulfillment of it, and that's just it, a lot of these sort of prophetic statements have maybe more than one fulfillment. In that first fulfillment of it, it's right there in his death, his burial, and his resurrection. But of course, the obvious application is the one that I think all of us hear more easily, and that is the distance between the ascension and the second coming. In a little while, you will see me no longer. Jesus will go up. He will, in a sense, kind of depart or be parted from his friends, although Paul has plenty to say in Ephesians 4 about what that ascension really means, and is he all that parted at all? But again, he's going to return. The angels told the disciples, the apostles, after he ascended, that he would return the same way they saw him go. He'd come back on the clouds. What's striking here is, of course, the meaning of the expression again, in a little while. Because 2,000 years have gone by, which is something I was trying to point out. 2,000 years have gone by since Jesus said those words, and since Jesus ascended into heaven. And that does not seem like a little while to us, which invites all that wonderful talk you heard me talking about throughout the year here. I started this back in January with the newsletter article that so many of you commented on and really seemed to appreciate, the 11 Theses on time. There's a way in which Christians have to kind of rethink their whole understanding of time as a result of the gospel. For God himself, 1,000 years is like a day. God doesn't really measure time, of course, the way we do. I don't think he's even all that concerned about it. The idea that heaven is eternal suggests a heaven without clocks, a heaven without watches, a heaven without planners and calendars, and won't that be nice, since those are some of the most wicked taskmasters in our lives. But anyway, but I wanted to throw in a third level of meaning, because I think this is true enough, and it was something I tried to get across to the children too, and that is that when we talk about a little while you will see me no longer, and again a little while and you will see me, I think we got to bring this down to how Jesus appears to us in his word and in his sacraments. So between divine services every week, when we depart church, we should be sad about departing church on Sunday, but we go back out into the world to return again on Sunday and see him again. And what's great about, like, say, the Lord's Supper is you get and the divine service in general is you get all the senses. You don't just get the seeing. You get the seeing, you get the hearing, you get the tasting, you get the touching. Taste and see that the Lord is good is a verse that's often used by pastors to describe what's going on in the Lord's Supper, and that is just one of our great blessings in life, is that Jesus, I don't think is as far away as we think. I don't think heaven is this far away place. It's more like I was at a Lutheran study on this subject a number of years ago. It's kind of like the next room in a lot of ways. But also this idea that the timelessness of it. Heaven touches earth when we gather together. That's why we hear in the liturgy, therefore with angels and archangels and with all the company of heaven, we laud and magnify your glorious name, evermore praising you and saying. That's a reminder that at that moment in the Lord's Supper, the worship of heaven is touching the worship of earth. And that's actually a wonderful little segue into my discussion of communion, because when we talk about the communion of saints, our Bible study, Life Together, and this last part of the Mondays at Mount Olive, until we take a break from that as well, is on the subject of the communion of saints. I'm calling it Life Together, and that communion does begin in the Lord's Supper. It begins in that communion, in Holy Communion. I talked about that last week and the implications of that. But there's a way in which in what's happening in heaven, when that reaches earth in the Lord's Supper, it reminds us that what's going on in a faithful congregation is a little mirror reflection of heaven itself. C.F.W. Walther, the founder of the Missouri Synod, founder of Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, which I'm a graduate of, used to instruct candidate pastors when they went out for their calls to view their churches as little Edens, little paradises on earth. And, I think we all probably can appreciate how tricky that can be. People want their churches to be little Edens, but they often find the little things that aren't very Eden-like, and pastors struggle against that as well. And so that sets up the question of what do you look for in a church? Or I really probably should have there, what should you look for in a church? Because we live in a day and age where people are hopping around in churches. I would say that there were two rather major technological advancements that really changed the way we do church. The first one was the printed Bible, by the way. I'm gonna put that in as number one. The Christian church pretty much did its ministry based on the hearing of the word, which is what Paul's talking about in Romans 10. That's a community thing. You're not in the Word simply by picking up the Bible. We have that luxury, but for 1,700 years, the church did not have that luxury. Maybe more like 17 to 1,800 years. The church did not have that luxury. The other technological advancement that has changed church in a huge way is the automobile. Now people can drift around a little bit more easily, and there's certain advantages to that. I think we all, love that. Those sorts of freedoms. There's a way in which in America your car is your freedom. It's kind of a big deal. But this freedom as it applies to churches is rather interesting because churches tended to be local entities, even sometimes in larger cities. The Church of Rome had all these other smaller churches, but they're all linked in with the Bishop of Rome. If you know anything about the history of the papacy and the history of the Roman Catholic Church, and even in the Lutheran Church, that was the case. But now, for instance, here in Madison, we have 7 Lutheran churches, and the question is, which one do you go to? Well, the honest answer is maybe the better question is, what should you look for in a church, and pray that all 7 of them are doing that. So that you can go to the one in your neighborhood or the one closest to you and get the same thing there that you get in the other churches. And that's been how things have changed, and how the communion of the church probably has been damaged a bit in more modern times, is that churches have maybe focused on some of the wrong things. So how do we look at helping our church be the best communion it can be in a day when people can get in a car and just drive somewhere else? And that's just it. I think in this modern age, we're starting to preoccupy ourselves with things that maybe aren't as important as we think they are with regard to churches. So I want to talk a little bit about what to look for in a church. We talked about this yesterday, and I'm really reflecting the ones that we talked about. By the way, these lists could go on forever. But I just wanted to bring up the stuff that was discussed yesterday. I began with the more positive question, what do you look for in a congregation? And these were the what I would call the good answers. And I will not say that the bad answers were all given by the Bible study. I did ask us to think about a couple of the answers that were given, and they do make it over into the other column. But by and large, it was a pretty good discussion, and I thought people were reflecting the right things for the most part. So as we say this, what are good things to look for in a congregation? First and foremost, the first answer had to do with preaching. And I had to push the person a bit because the whole question of what is good preaching gets answered poorly these days as well. So when it can't be one about the preacher, and two, it can't just be about being interesting. I know many really well. I mean, the TV preachers are masters at this. They're masters at saying very little while being very interesting in the process. And I don't have a lot of use for that. At the same time, some of the best preachers I've ever known were not firebrands in the pulpit, but their message, their content was outstanding, and that's what's got to come first. So when that subject of preaching came up, I focused that a bit. Clear gospel preaching and ministry. Good preaching is law and gospel preaching. And the law is not just the law about the awful, terrible world out there, but it is about the sin that's in here, in my heart and in yours, and it is centered on Jesus, and good preaching delivers Jesus. It delivers Jesus into your hands. So There's a lot of talk today about preaching style, just like there's a lot of talk about music style. And I'm going to say that both those discussions, because they're about style, fall into the other category. I could go up there in skinny jeans and tennis shoes like some preachers do in some churches. There's reasons why we dress the way we do as pastors, that there's a teaching aspect to all of that. And that's for another Mondays at Mount Olive. But for the time being, I'm just going to simply say that a lot of times when I see skinny jeans and tennis shoes, I already know what I'm going to get message-wise, and it's not what I need. It's not what most people need. It may be what they want to hear, but it may not necessarily be what they need to hear. The next thing that came up, actually was further down the list, but I'm just kind of listing it sort of the way I'm listing it. It came up, especially every Sunday communion came up, but under a broader category, I'm going to put that under faithful administration of sacraments. The sacraments are the visible Word of God. So if the Word of God in preaching is important for a church, the visible Word of God in the sacraments should be important too. And every Sunday communion is a Lutheran thing. I put the citation on the slide for you. Augsburg Confession and the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, Article 24, both mention and state emphatically that the Lutherans celebrate the Mass, which was the divine service, the Lord's Supper, every Lord's Day, in keeping with 1,500 years of practice, in keeping with the book of Acts, where it sure does appear to be an every Sunday thing, and there does not seem to be, as you look at church history, any breaks in that. And the Lutherans didn't break it either, and interestingly, neither did the radical reformers of the Reformation, the more radical ones, because the Lutheran was pretty conservative, truthfully. They didn't break that either. In fact, the whole rhythm of weekly communion, every Sunday communion, does not break until the 19th century. Maybe the 18th and 19th centuries. And now Lutheran churches are bringing it back. And as part of our study, I want to talk to Reverend Dr. Ken Weeding, my vicarage pastor, who did his doctorate of ministry at the Fort Wayne Seminary on this very topic. He wrote 2 books on the subject as well, and he's going to be doing an interview with me this summer on this. He and I talked about it this past week on the phone, and I'm excited about that because we brought that back as a result of COVID, and that was a good reason to do it. But believe it or not, the less frequent practices of it are out of line with most of the history of the church and certainly our Lutheran confessions. And that's because this is a gift, and you don't want to say no to a gift. I mean, that's bottom line. So those sorts of things are important to look for in a church. Next that came up was compassion and care within the congregation. And that is that's something I hear from the good many new members that have joined our congregation in the short time I've been here. They talk a lot about the welcoming nature of Mount Olive and the care we seem to show within the walls, and that's a marvelous thing. I believe that should always kind of come second to the first 2 things we just talked about. But it should be there. It's unfortunate where you see churches that do have good gospel preaching and ministry and faithful administration of the sacraments, and they are just cold as ice on Sunday morning. I've known many churches like this. Perhaps you belong to them in the past too. I don't know. I would just simply say, if the gospel of Jesus Christ is there in a powerful way, it should be visible through the care of the congregation. So I think that's not a bad reason not a bad thing to look for in a church. And lastly, opportunities for continued learning came up. And, that's interesting. It just came from a pastor's conference where we had a bit of a discussion about this. And there's been a lot of trends with regard to, like, say, Bible study in particular in recent years. And I think it's time maybe we revisited some of those trends just a little bit, because the question really is Bible study happening in some of these scenarios for the sake of learning more from the Bible, or is it for the sake of a social time with friends? And I'm not against a social time with friends, but again, like a lot of things in the church, sometimes the main thing may not always be the main thing. I think the challenge we always have, as one pastor delightfully put it, the main thing is keeping the main thing the main thing. And so what are you looking for in Bible study? If you're looking for a lot of discussion, the question is, are you looking for a lot of learning? And that has always been the tension. The tension is between, like, say, in a pastor-run Bible study, should the pastor teach more or should he enable discussion more? And I actually do lean on he should teach more, but I'm not against discussion. As long as that discussion, we can keep focused within the content that's actually being taught. What is the purpose? I mean, the church is told not to, the church is told to teach. Jesus says, make disciples, baptizing and teaching. He says, teach, teach, teach. And so when we talk about Bible study, the question, I think, is how much teaching are we doing and how much socializing are we doing? And there's certainly a place for that. There's also other venues where we can do the socializing as well. There's nothing wrong with having within that care and compassion. That's a good thing. Having a good social situation in the church is a wonderful thing, by the way. But it may not necessarily be the teaching. And if faith comes by hearing, it's very important that the teaching happens so that we can open our ears and hear. Well, those are good things. All of them are good things. Clear gospel preaching, faithful administration of the sacraments, care inside the congregation, and plenty of opportunities for continued growth. Life, I explained life yesterday in Bible study as finishing school for heaven, which is to say we are going to, Jesus says teach because we continue to need to be taught. But let's talk about the things that do matter too much. And I'm going to take the first two together, music style and preaching style. They're two of the same things. The music style thing is caught up also in what something that I think really did damage our communion in a big way in the last 50 years, and that is what we call the culture wars. Johann Sebastian Bach wrote a ton of church music, as you know. And yes, he wrote it in the style of his time. But he did not do it under this constant pressure to be, quote-unquote, contemporary. He did it because that was how he knew how to write music, and that was the end of it. He looked for ways, which is also something I don't always see in today's music. He looked for ways to express theological points in the music. He had this thing called sighing, which was always, whenever the Holy Spirit came up in the text, he developed this musical sigh, the 4/3 suspension, da 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 da. You know, the whole point of trying to keep up with the Joneses was not an issue for Johann Sebastian Bach. It is in today's church world. And what's interesting, too, is that there are a whole bunch of new numbers about who's growing and who's not that are coming out. And that's kind of fascinating because I think what we're seeing is a lot of evangelical websites starting to say, you know what, it doesn't really matter the style as long as you do it well. That's been the new theme in a lot of that. And that's sort of what I agree, too. I am pro almost every style. My Sirius XM favorites list is forever. Country, especially more old school country, jazz, classical, rock, yacht rock, even ambient music. I've got them all favorited on my Sirius XM. I kind of like all the styles. I don't need a particular style. What I need is the message. So the thing with regard to music is is music a means of delivering the message or is it the message itself? Luther called music the gospel's handmaiden. And that word now is taking on a negative connotation, but he certainly didn't mean it that way. It's there to serve the message because the message is always first. That's because Christ is always first. So when you're listening to anything that says it's Christian, my encouragement to you is listen for how much Christ you're hearing in there. And listen again for first-person pronouns. I've talked about that before. I, me, my is not necessarily Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And so those are, all I'm saying is music is important. But if we're going to get bogged down in arguments about style, we are going to shoot ourselves in the foot. And we actually, I believe the consensus across Christianity is we have. Yes, some churches use very contemporary music, for instance, very effectively, but many churches are using less contemporary. I'm not going to go to the word traditional because I'm not sold on either of these terms, truthfully. But what we're seeing is churches that use some very, very solid music one way or the other. That's the more important thing, is the message. Same thing with the preaching. Like I said before, I could put on sneakers and skinny pants and walk around and stalk around all over. All that is style stuff. And that's all that is. I just saw the documentary it's called The Sins of Hillsong. It's about the Hillsong Church in New York. And I really started to feel for the pastor there, even though he failed ridiculously and cannot be a pastor again, to be sure. he seems like he has repented quite a bit. And, the interesting thing is, and this goes down to what I said, what I have down at the bottom of that list too about pastor's personality. I think he was set up for failure. And that's because of all these pressures we put on the church that aren't central to being the church. And they do put a lot of pressure on congregations. So preaching style is another one of those things. Let the pastor be the pastor. Listen for the message. Listen for Christ. Listen for law and gospel. And I would argue, don't judge him based on was it interesting or not. Some pastors are, perhaps so bland that it does get in the way of the message. But most of the pastors and preachers that I really admire, again, they're not firebrands, but they get the point across. And so we got to train our ears to listen and not just our eyes to see. Politics is a huge one these days too. The accusation, for instance, that a lot of churches have gone into Christian nationalism and that's reflecting politics. There may be elements of truth to that, but those same complaints were said about the moral majority in the 80s. Oh, and they were made also about mainstream Protestantism back in the 50s and 60s as they threw out the Bible and went after left-wing politics as well. So you see, this isn't one side or the other. And that's just it. The church should really avoid getting into all of that. The church should be about the gospel and not necessarily about particular positions. I know people sometimes bounce around because they know they're going to get a more politically based message, one that they agree with in another church, just like they do with their networks and whatever else that they, social media and whatever else. I just think that's a bad idea. The church, Jesus, as you've heard me say before, is delightfully ambivalent about rulers in general. He doesn't get too deep into the weeds about them. But Pilate, he kind of treats as an ordinary Joe in that interview, and I just think that's maybe a better approach. We should be concerned about you're free and entitled to have your politics. If you want to talk with me about them, we can do that outside of church here. But inside these walls, we really want to be about Jesus, Jesus, only Jesus. And politics does not always, and current events do not always magnify that discussion. And let me get back around to the pastor's personality for just a minute too. Like I said before, when I saw the Sins of Hillsong, what I saw was a pastor who was really edgy when he was there, and he was very, very, he was kind of like punk, if pastors could be punk. And he failed. He failed mightily. And now he's not any of those things. He seems very humble, like he's learned quite a lesson from it. And it really is true, I think, that the spotlight that threw on him probably contributed to his fall. I appreciate it when people, try to offer me compliments or whatever, but I think one of the best compliments I ever got was from a lady in my last church who said, "Pastor, you are so very hard to compliment." And I would rather be that way, truthfully. I think humility is an important part of being a pastor. It's an important part of being a Christian. And I'm not always humble. I'm not saying I am, but it is something I strive for every day. And the pastor's personality is, if it's important, it's only hopefully, again, in magnifying Jesus. Just like if music or preaching style or any of these things have any kind of importance, it's only in magnifying Jesus. Our communion is rooted in Jesus. Well, I'm going to stop there. Thank you for watching. It's Mondays at Mount Olive. We'll hopefully see you next week. This coming Sunday is the 6th Sunday of Easter. It's also Memorial Day weekend, and we will remember in the prayers those who gave their lives for the sacrifice for our country. And I will also encourage you to remember something that a veteran taught me a long time ago when I was a young pastor. Don't confuse this for Veterans Day. Veterans Day is in November. This is the day about those who died. Protecting our freedoms. And so I hopefully you have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy those freedoms when they come up, and give thanks. Give thanks for their service. Again, we'll see you next week. This is Mondays at Mount Olive. Have a great week.